A billionaire visited his daughter's grave, expecting silence. Instead, he found a janitor kneeling in front of her headstone, crying softly, with a small child clinging to his arm. And in that quiet cemetery, on the anniversary of his daughter's death, a truth Richard Whitmore never imagined was about to shatter the steel fortress of his life. Richard's life had been built like an empire of polished stone, gleaming, towering, and unyielding. His penthouse sat high above Manhattan, perched on the 57th floor of the Whitmore Tower, a building he owned down to the last bolt. He had spent decades constructing a world of power and wealth, one so insulated that even pain struggled to slip through the cracks. At 56, Richard was what New York magazines called untouchable. His charcoal hair streaked with dignified silver, his posture precise as though he were carved from granite, and his eyes, once bright, mischievous blue, had grown darker with age. They carried something heavy, something old, a weight money couldn't smother. He was the real estate titan of the Northeast, the man who bought the sky and sold pieces of it. But in the penthouse dripping with modern art and marble floors, with hallways silent as a tomb, success had a hollow ring. The echo followed him everywhere. It haunted him more each year. Because all the empire in the world couldn't fill the absence of one person. Isabel Marie Whitmore, his daughter, his only child, gone. 10 years, an entire decade. Yet the memory of that night had never faded, not even by a fraction. It was a stormy night in October. Rain drowned the city, turning every streetlight into a trembling blur. The car Isabel was riding in skidded off the slick highway. Witnesses said it spun twice before the vehicle broke through the guardrail. The Hudson River swallowed it whole. She was 24. 24. A lifetime ahead of her, and yet all he remembered was the stillness of her face, framed by wet strands of hair stuck to her cheeks as if she were simply resting, waiting to wake up. He wasn't there when she died. That single truth had carved him from the inside out. He had been across the world, in a boardroom in Seoul, pitching a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His phone buzzed once, twice, then again. His assistant finally dared to step into the meeting. "Mr. Whitmore, it's an emergency." His blood had gone cold. The flight back was 14 hours. 14 hours of freezing dread and prayers whispered to a God he had long stopped believing in. By the time he landed, raced to the hospital, shoved through the doors, and demanded answers, she was gone. He saw her in a cold room, covered by a white sheet. He remembered his hands shaking, him, the man whose hands never shook, as he pulled the sheet back and stared at a face he had given life to. Peaceful, quiet, far too quiet. "I'm sorry," he had whispered. "Isabel, sweetheart, I'm so sorry." But apologies spoken to the dead never reached the ears they were meant for. Every year since, he visited her grave alone, flowers in hand, regret in heart, silence in soul. This year, though, something felt different before he even stepped out of the town car. The air carried an edge, as if the world was holding its breath. The cemetery was still damp from the morning drizzle, the grass glistening with beads of water, the sky heavy with unfallen rain. Richard's polished shoes sank slightly into the soft earth as he walked the familiar path toward Section C, Row 9, Isabel's resting place. He expected the quiet. He expected the loneliness. He expected the familiar ache tightening around his ribs. What he did not expect was the sight waiting for him. A man, wearing a faded maintenance uniform, knelt in front of Isabel's headstone, shoulders shaking as he cried silently. Beside him stood a little girl, no older than 5 or maybe 6, holding his hand tightly, her big brown eyes locked on the photograph embedded in the stone. Richard slowed to a stop. For a second, He wondered if he was imagining it, if grief had finally twisted itself into visions. But no, the man was real, the child was real, and they were standing inches from his daughter's grave as though they had every right in the world to be there. Richard's stomach tightened. He cleared his throat softly. The man jolted, scrambling to wipe his face. Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come up. I didn't mean. We'll leave right away. But the little girl didn't move. She stared up at Richard with curious caution, her hand still clutching the man's sleeve. Richard glanced down at the headstone, at the flowers the stranger had placed, at the small paper crane the child had tucked under Isabel's name. Something twisted painfully inside him. No, Richard said quietly, you don't need to leave. The janitor swallowed hard, but his eyes darted to the child as if unsure. Richard looked down at the girl again. Something about her hit him like a blow he didn't understand yet. The shape of her small chin, the delicate curve of her eyebrows, the way her hair curled softly at the ends. Something disturbingly familiar. He crouched slightly, leveling himself with her. Hello, he said gently. She blinked once, twice, then pointed a tiny finger at the grave. She's my mommy. Time stopped. Richard's breath punched out of him as if someone had struck him in the chest. His pulse hammered so violently he could hear it in his ears. What did you say? His voice was barely audible. The janitor's face went white. Sweetheart, don't. But the child's gaze didn't waver. She's my mommy, she repeated softly. Her name was Isabel. Every ounce of warmth drained from his body. His heart slammed against his ribs. The trees around him swayed in silence. The world tilted, threatening to collapse under the weight of 9 unspoken words. She's my mommy. Isabel. His Isabel. His daughter he lost a decade ago. A granddaughter he never knew existed. Richard stumbled back, gripping the nearest tree trunk just to stay upright. Is this some kind of mistake? His voice cracked. The janitor looked down in shame, tears pooling again. I didn't want it to happen this way. I swear I didn't. I never planned to bring her here when anyone else was around. Richard's vision blurred. His world, his carefully constructed empire, his hardened heart, his grief-honed solitude cracked open, splitting down the center like shattered glass. He forced the words out, each one painful. Who are you? The janitor exhaled shakily, eyes filled with something raw and terrified. My name is Daniel Reyes, and 10 years ago I was in love with your daughter. Richard heard the words, but his brain refused to accept them. His daughter had died with secrets, and one of them was standing right in front of him, with tear-stained cheeks, tiny trembling hands, and eyes that looked achingly, devastatingly familiar. The truth Richard never knew existed had finally risen from the grave, and nothing in his life, not his wealth, not his power, not his grief, would ever be the same again. For a long moment, Richard could only stare at the man kneeling in the mud, the janitor who dared to say he'd loved Isabel, the janitor whose little girl claimed Isabel was her mother. The cemetery wind whistled gently across the rows of tombstones, but all Richard heard was a hollow ringing inside his skull, like a bell struck too hard. He forced himself to breathe. Once, twice, as if learning how again. Daniel Reyes. The name meant nothing, yet the weight behind it felt crushing. The man looked young, mid-30s at most, but exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders. His maintenance uniform was faded at the collar, the name patch frayed. His hands were calloused, rough, the kind earned from labor, not boardrooms. Tears still clung to his lashes, tears shed openly, emotionally, without shame. The child beside him clung tighter to his sleeve. Richard could barely bring himself to look at her again. Every glimpse was like looking into a ghost. No, worse. A reflection that shouldn't exist. Isabel's eyes. Her exact eyes. Big, warm, gentle. A brown so deep it almost looked like honey in sunlight. He remembered those eyes, staring up at him the first time she rode a bike, the first time she read a whole book by herself, the last time they spoke, the day before she died. "Dad, are you listening?" He remembered pretending he was. He remembered her small frown when she realized he wasn't. And now, a decade later, her eyes watched him from the face of a child he never knew. Richard swallowed hard. "Explain," he said quietly. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It had the calm of a storm about to break. "Tell me exactly why you're standing at my daughter's grave with a child calling her mother." Daniel tightened his grip on the little girl's hand, as though bracing for impact. "Sir, it's not simple." Richard's jaw clenched. It had better be. The janitor looked away, breath shaking. "I didn't plan this. I wasn't going to involve you. I wasn't going to disrupt your life or—" He stopped, corrected himself. "Or hers." Emotion knotted in Richard's throat in a way he hated. It made him feel weak, unstable, a man without control. "My daughter is dead," he said sharply. "There is no life left to disrupt." The child's little shoulders jumped at the harsh tone. Richard immediately regretted it, but the words were already in the air, hanging heavily. Luna, if that was really her name, edged closer to Daniel, her tiny fingers bunching the fabric of his uniform. Daniel whispered, "It's okay, mija," and rubbed her back gently. Richard felt another blow to the chest. The tenderness, the familiarity, the fatherly instinct. This man wasn't pretending. He wasn't lying. He'd loved the little girl. And the little girl looked at Isabel's grave the way a child looks at something they long for, something they don't fully understand but feel deeply. Richard's throat tightened painfully. He motioned stiffly. "Stand up, both of you." Daniel rose slowly. The little girl followed, her shoes sinking into the damp soil. She wore a yellow sweater 2 sizes too big and jeans patched at the knees. Her hair was tied into 2 small braids, but wisps had escaped everywhere. She looked nothing like the children Richard saw in his world, polished, groomed, dressed in designer clothes. She looked real, alive, loved. Daniel stood protectively in front of her without even realizing it. Richard noticed. "Start talking," Richard said. His voice was calm, but his hands had curled slightly, betraying the tension in him. Daniel inhaled deeply. "I met Isabel 11 years ago." Richard stiffened. 11 years. A year before her death. She was volunteering at a community center in Queens. teaching music to underprivileged kids. Teaching my students. Richard blinked. My daughter was teaching in Queens? His voice cracked into disbelief. Why didn't I? He stopped himself. He already knew why. He didn't know because he never asked. He didn't know because work came first. He didn't know because Isabel had long stopped filling him in on her life, tired of being met with distracted nods and half-listened conversations.
Daniel continued quietly. She came every Wednesday, without fail, rain or snow. She'd sit on the dusty floor with the kids, let them play her guitar, even though half of them never washed their hands. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth at the memory. She was sunshine, Daniel whispered, even on her worst days. Richard felt something inside him tremble. He remembered that sunshine. It used to fill their penthouse when she was a little girl. Did you date her? Richard demanded. He didn't mean for it to sound angry, but it did. Daniel nodded. Richard looked away, blinking rapidly. I loved her, Daniel said softly. From the moment she showed up to class wearing 2 different shoes and laughing about it like it didn't matter. The child looked up at him. Daddy, she whispered, as if reminding him she was there. Richard flinched. Daddy? The words sliced him open. A decade of grief felt suddenly different, wrong, incomplete, deceptive. His daughter hadn't died alone. She hadn't died without love. She hadn't died without leaving something behind. Daniel leaned down, brushing the child's hair back with trembling fingers. This is Luna, your daughter's little girl. Richard felt the entire world tilt. His vision blurred at the edges. Impossible. She wasn't showing yet when the accident happened. She hadn't told you. She hadn't told anyone but me. Daniel exhaled shakily. We planned to tell you after she reached the 2nd trimester. She wanted to do it right. She wanted you to be part of the baby's life. Richard staggered, steadying himself on the nearest headstone. 2nd trimester.
She had been pregnant when she died. Pregnant. His daughter, his only child, carrying another life. A life that survived. He felt nausea roll through him, emotional and physical. He tried to reconcile the image of Isabel's pale, lifeless body in the hospital with the knowledge she had been carrying his grandchild when he held her hand for the last time. He hadn't known. He hadn't been told. He hadn't been there. Again. Daniel stepped forward slightly. Sir, she loved you, no matter what you think. She always said you were just tired, busy, trying. Richard pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. A lie. A kind one, but a lie all the same. The little girl tugged lightly at Daniel's sleeve. Daddy, she whispered. What is it, mija? She pointed at Richard with a small, trembling finger. Is he mad at me? The question stabbed Richard in a place he didn't know was still tender. He dropped to one knee slowly, not because of his age, but because his legs couldn't hold him. No, he whispered hoarsely. I'm not mad at you. Luna studied him with wide, searching eyes. Richard's voice cracked. I'm just surprised. Daniel swallowed. Sir, I know this is a shock, and I don't expect anything from you. Not money, not involvement. We've managed alone. I only bring her here on Isabel's anniversary, just to honor her, not to interfere with your life." Richard stared at the man, really stared. A janitor, a single father, a man who had loved his daughter, a man raising the only piece left of her, and he had done it quietly, humbly, without asking for a cent. Richard had never felt smaller in his life. The wind rustled through the cemetery again, carrying the soft scent of wet grass and wilting flowers. Richard's voice came out as a whisper. "Why? Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you call? Write. Reach out." Daniel lifted his eyes, filled with something like sorrow and something like guilt. "I tried," he said softly. "What?" "I tried," Daniel repeated. "Many times. You never responded." Richard froze. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. Daniel looked down. "I wrote letters, emails. I even drove to the Whitmore offices once." He swallowed thickly. "Your staff always sent me away, said people like me didn't get personal meetings with you." Richard's blood ran cold. "People like me." The words echoed like a punch. He had built an empire so impenetrable, so elite, so guarded, that even the truth couldn't reach him. Even his own granddaughter couldn't reach him. Even the father of his daughter's child couldn't reach him. Richard stared at Luna again, at the small braid slipping down her shoulder, at the way she held Daniel's hand tightly, at the eyes that mirrored Isabel so perfectly it hurt to breathe. He felt something break inside him, quietly, completely. A crack that had been forming for 10 long years finally split open. He whispered her name, as if testing it aloud for the first time. "Luna." She blinked up at him. "Yes?" Richard's lip trembled, a rare, raw crack in the armor he had worn for decades. He stopped. He swallowed thickly. "I can talk to you for a moment?" Daniel stiffened protectively. "Sir?" Richard held up a hand. "I'm not angry. I swear I'm not. I just want to know her." Words he never imagined saying. Words he never imagined needing. Daniel hesitated, then slowly nodded. Luna stepped forward, carefully, looking up at the man she did not know. Not yet. And Richard, billionaire, titan, king of Manhattan's skyline, felt tears burn his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't fight them, because standing before him was the one thing he had spent a decade mourning: a second chance.
Richard had never struggled to speak in his life, not in boardrooms, not on stages, not when signing billion-dollar contracts or announcing mergers that shook Wall Street. But now, in a quiet cemetery with rain threatening overhead, he felt like a man who had forgotten how to use language. How do you speak to a ghost? How do you explain 10 years of absence? How do you talk to a child whose existence rewrites the story of your entire life? Luna stopped a few feet in front of him, small arms hugging her yellow sweater like a shield. Richard inhaled shakily. You have your mother's eyes," he said softly. She tilted her head. "My mommy?" He nodded, a painful smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Yes, Isabel. She was my daughter." Luna blinked several times, as if processing the information piece by piece, the way children do when the world feels too big. "Daddy told me she was an angel," she whispered, "but I never saw her. I only see her picture." Richard felt the breath leave his lungs. Daniel stepped closer, speaking gently. "She knows the truth, sir, that Isabel passed away long before she was born, but she likes to imagine her mommy watches over her." Luna looked at the headstone, her small fingers fidgeting. "I bring her flowers, 'cause angels get lonely." Richard's throat closed completely. He reached a hand out, very slowly, and brushed away a stray petal from the grass. His fingers trembled. "Thank you," he whispered, "for taking care of her spot." Luna smiled shyly. "I like it here. It's quiet, and the birds sing." Richard swallowed hard. "Do you come often?" "Every October," she said proudly. "Daddy says that's when angels listen the most." Daniel cleared his throat, embarrassment and grief flickering across his face. "I didn't want her to forget Isabel. Even if she never met her, she deserved to feel her mother's love somehow." Richard glanced at him sharply, and for the first time, without anger. How could he feel anger toward a man who had raised Isabel's daughter with tenderness and devotion? Richard turned back to Luna. "What else did your daddy tell you about her?" Luna thought for a moment, swaying on her heels. "That she loved music, and she laughed a lot, and she would have loved me." Her lower lip wobbled suddenly. "But I wish she could have hugged me, just once." Richard felt his heart splinter. He reached forward, instinctively, helplessly, but stopped himself halfway, realizing he didn't have the right. Not yet. Daniel noticed the hesitation. He knelt beside Luna and whispered something gently into her ear. She nodded, then took a tentative step toward Richard. "Can I ask something?" she said softly. Richard forced a smile. "Anything." "Why are you crying?" He hadn't realized the tear had fallen. He wiped it quickly. "Because I miss her. Very much." Luna nodded solemnly. "I miss her too, even though I don't know her." That was when Richard's composure finally cracked. He pressed both hands to his face, shoulders shaking. It was silent at first, the kind of grief that had been buried so deep it didn't remember how to come out. Daniel looked away respectfully, giving him space. Luna stepped closer, and in the gentlest, most innocent gesture, she placed her small hand over his. "It's okay," she whispered. "Daddy says crying makes the heart lighter." Richard lowered his hand slowly. Her palm remained against his cheek, warm, soft, steady, a comfort he didn't deserve but needed more than air. He held her fingers lightly, as if afraid she might disappear. "Your daddy," Richard said quietly, "is a wise man." Luna beamed. "He's the best daddy." Richard looked up at Daniel, really looked. He saw a tired man, a working man, a man who probably lived paycheck to paycheck, a man who wiped tears and braided hair and worked double shifts to buy a doll for Christmas, a man Isabel had loved, a man who had raised her child with dignity. Daniel stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Sir, I think it's time I explain everything." Richard nodded. "Yes," he said, "please." They all sat on the low stone bench nearby, Richard on one side, Daniel and Luna on the other. The headstone stood between them like a silent witness. Daniel began slowly, voice thick with memory. "Your daughter, she wasn't supposed to come to the community center. She stumbled in one day because she'd taken the wrong train." Richard felt a bittersweet smile tug at him. Isabel was always getting lost, on maps, on purpose, in life. Daniel continued. "She saw one of the kids crying, a little boy named Mateo. His violin broke and his family couldn't afford another. Isabel got down on the floor with him, held his hands, and promised she'd find a way to fix it." He chuckled softly.
She never fixed a violin in her life, but she spent 3 hours on YouTube that night figuring it out, came back the next day with glue, new strings, and a pack of cookies. Richard closed his eyes. He could see it perfectly. Her kneeling on a dusty floor, her hair tied badly, her heart too big for her tiny frame. Daniel's voice softened. That was her. She didn't care about money or titles. She cared about people. He looked down. That's why she cared about me. Richard felt the sting of truth. In Isabel's world, love wasn't defined by wealth or class. She'd been searching for connection, for meaning. The things he'd never understood were more important than skyscrapers or legacy. Daniel continued. We started dating quietly. She didn't want it public. I didn't either. We both knew how different our worlds were. Richard stiffened, guilt washing through him again. She was afraid I'd disapprove, he muttered slowly. Daniel nodded once. She didn't want to argue with you again. The words hit hard, because they were true. Father and daughter had fought constantly in the months before she died. Daniel swallowed. When she found out she was pregnant, she was scared, but happy, happier than I'd ever seen her. She couldn't wait to tell you. She said, maybe the baby would bring you two back together. Richard shut his eyes tight, fighting a wave of grief. She was going to tell you on her birthday, the day before the accident. Richard's breath hitched. Her birthday. He remembered that call. She had invited him to dinner. And his stomach twisted violently. And I told her I couldn't go because I had meetings. Daniel nodded painfully. She cried that night, but she told me you were doing your best. Richard felt like vomiting. The cemetery blurred, his ears rang, everything inside him screamed with regret. Luna leaned against Daniel, her small voice breaking the silence. What happened to my mommy, Daddy? Daniel looked at her. We've talked about this, Mija. I know, but Richard was there. Maybe he knows more. Richard froze. That single sentence shifted something inside him, something irreversible. She wanted answers. His answers. He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to steady. Your mommy, he began slowly, was kind and brave, and she tried very hard to live a life full of love. Luna nodded, listening intently. She had an accident, he continued, a very bad one, and she went to heaven. Luna looked at the grave. Is she happy there? Richard swallowed. I like to believe she is. Luna seemed satisfied and rested her head against Daniel's arm. Richard looked up at them, this makeshift family that had formed without him, the family Isabel had dreamed of, a family he had never known existed. Daniel, he whispered, staring at the man, why didn't you push harder? Why didn't you demand I listen? Why didn't you show up on my doorstep? Daniel held Richard's gaze, steady, honest, exhausted. Because I'm not part of your world, he said quietly, and I didn't want your world to crush hers. Richard opened his mouth, then shut it, because he understood. Better than he wanted to. Luna suddenly slipped her small hand into Richard's again. Are you lonely? She asked softly. He blinked. She didn't ask it with judgment, only concern. Richard's voice trembled as he finally answered truthfully. Yes, he whispered. Very much. She squeezed his hand. You can sit with us, she said simply, if you want. And something inside Richard Whitmore, billionaire, titan, father haunted by grief, collapsed into humility. For once in his life, he said yes.
Richard had sat in boardrooms with men who would devour an empire for breakfast. He had stared down hostile CEOs, negotiated with billionaires, walked into rooms where the air itself seemed to cost money. None of those moments had shaken him the way it felt now, sitting on a cold stone bench in a small cemetery beside the janitor and a little girl he had never known existed, whose every breath felt like a rebuke to the life he'd lived. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like a Titan or a Whitmore. He felt like a man stripped bare. Luna had wandered just a few feet away, picking clovers from the damp grass and humming under her breath. Her innocence made the world feel less suffocating, at least for a moment. Daniel sat stiffly, rubbing his palms together. His gaze kept darting toward Richard as if he was preparing for a storm. And maybe he was. "Daniel," Richard said, finally, voice roughened by the weight of the truth that had been unraveling piece by piece, "you should have told me." Daniel's jaw tensed. "I tried," he said quietly. Richard's eyes narrowed. He leaned back slightly, absorbing the words. "You tried? When?" Daniel didn't flinch from the challenge in his tone. "Twice. The first time was right after Isabel found out she was pregnant. I called your office. Your assistant never let me through." Richard's stomach clenched. He could already picture it, the wall of buffers he'd built around himself, assistants trained to filter his life into only what he considered important. He had thought it was efficiency. Now it felt like a cage he had constructed with his own hands. "And the second time?" he asked quietly. Daniel looked down at his fingers. "After she died." The words hit him like a blow. "I went to the hospital. They wouldn't tell me anything because I wasn't family. I tried to see her, but they said the body had already been claimed and moved for private arrangements." Richard swallowed hard. "I didn't know about you, or the baby." Daniel nodded slowly. "I figured that out. I knew if you had known, you would have reacted." Richard looked at him sharply. "You make that sound like a bad thing." Daniel exhaled. "It would have destroyed me." The honesty in that simple statement cut deeper than any accusation, because it was true. If he had known Isabel was with a janitor, a man earning barely above minimum wage, a man who could never fit into the picture-perfect future he had envisioned for her, he might have tried to pull them apart. He might have succeeded. Daniel's voice was steady now, each word carrying the weight of quiet conviction. "I loved your daughter. I would have married her, given her everything I had. But I didn't have much, and I knew if you came into the picture, I would lose her." Richard stared at him, the old anger rising before he could stop it. "So you hid her from me?" Daniel's jaw flashed with hurt. "No, she hid herself, because she loved you even when she was angry. She didn't want you to see her as someone who threw away her future." Richard flinched. "I would never have seen her that way." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "You did." Silence fell, heavy as the October clouds overhead. Luna looked up from her patch of clovers, sensing tension, but Daniel gave her a reassuring nod. She went back to plucking them, though she cast worried glances between the two men. Richard dragged a hand through his hair. "Daniel, I wasn't a perfect father. I know that." "No parent is," Daniel replied softly. "But you loved her. She told me that." Richard felt something inside him loosen painfully, a knot that had been tied since the night he saw Isabel's body under that white sheet. She told me that?" he whispered. Daniel nodded. "Every time you argued and she came to me crying, she would say, 'He doesn't understand, but he loves me. I know he does.'" Richard stared at the ground. If regret were a living thing, it would have been strangling him now. There was a long, trembling breath before Daniel added, "She wanted to make you proud. Even when she didn't want your approval, she still needed it." A bitter sound escaped Richard, half laugh, half sob. "She had it. She always had it."
Daniel looked away, giving him a moment. Luna returned with a small bouquet of clovers in her hands. "Look," she said proudly, "I made a flower." Daniel smiled and ruffled her hair. "It's beautiful." She waddled to Isabel's headstone and placed the clover bouquet at its base. Then she touched the carved letters gently, almost reverently. "Hi, Mommy," she whispered. "We're all here." Richard's chest tightened so violently he thought he might shatter. He stood slowly and walked toward her, each step an act of courage he hadn't known he still possessed. "Luna," he asked softly, "can I tell you something about your mommy?" The little girl turned, glowing with curiosity. "Okay." He kneeled beside her to be at eye level. "Your mommy," he said carefully, "used to dance in the kitchen, very badly. She had no rhythm at all, but she loved it. And she would make me join her." Luna giggled. "Did you dance too?" "Yes," he said with a tiny smile. "Quite terribly." She leaned against the gravestone lovingly. "I wish I saw that." Richard swallowed, emotion building again. "I wish you had too." They stayed there for a moment, the three of them orbiting around the memory of a woman who had changed all their lives. Then Richard rose and walked back to Daniel with a new tension gripping him, not anger, but resolve. "Daniel, I want to be in her life." Daniel stiffened immediately. The quiet peace between them tightened like a wire. "Sir, I'm not asking for custody. I'm not asking to take her away from you. I'm asking to know her, to know my granddaughter, to try to be someone she can trust." Daniel's expression flickered rapidly. Fear, hope, protectiveness, grief. "She's my whole world," he said quietly. "And she should be," Richard replied. They stared at each other, two men with nothing in common except the love of the same woman, one lost to time, one standing a few feet away picking clovers and humming a tune beyond her own understanding. Daniel exhaled shakily. "I'm scared of what your world could do to her." Richard felt the truth in that. His world was sharp edges and power plays, paparazzi, and ruthless ambition. It was a place where people like Luna were swallowed whole. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I want to try to do this right." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward his daughter. "Let me ask you something," he said suddenly. "If Isabel had lived and kept the baby and married me, would you have accepted it?" The question pierced straight through Richard. The truth was ugly, painful, and very real. "No," he admitted raw. "I wouldn't have." Daniel's face fell, a small, quiet devastation. "But," Richard continued firmly, "I would now." Daniel looked at him, startled. "I can't change who I was, or what I ruined. But I can change who I become for her." His voice cracked on the last word. Daniel studied him for a long, tense moment, the kind of evaluation only a father makes when trying to decide if the world is safe enough for his child. Finally he spoke. "Luna?" The little girl looked up from her pile of clovers. "Yeah?" "Would you like to spend more time with Richard?" Daniel asked gently. Luna blinked, then smiled shyly. "He's nice. And sad, but nice." Richard let out a breath that felt like his first in years. Daniel gave a small nod. "We'll try," he whispered. "But slowly, carefully." Richard nodded, grateful beyond words. Then something inside him, something long buried, cracked open. Because this wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of a war he hadn't expected. A war between the man he used to be and the man he wanted to become. And for the first time in more than a decade, Richard Whitmore was willing to fight.
The first crack in Richard Whitmore's world didn't come from the media or his business rivals or the vultures always circling billionaires. It came from a little hand tugging on his sleeve. The day after he met Luna, he found himself walking through Central Park beside Daniel and the child he had never known existed. He had cleared his entire schedule, unheard of, leaving his assistant in stunned disbelief. Luna held a melting vanilla cone in one hand and Richard's sleeve in the other. She looked up at him with wide brown eyes that had Isabel's sparkle and Daniel's gentleness. "Do you have any kids?" she asked suddenly, licking the side of her ice cream. Richard froze. I had one." "Is she big?" she chirped. His breath hitched. "She was, before she went to heaven." Luna processed this with tragic innocence. "My mommy's in heaven too," she said matter-of-factly. "Maybe they play together." He swallowed hard. "Maybe they do." Daniel watched the exchange, guarded but not hostile. He was still learning who Richard was now, compared to who he had been long ago. Richard wished he knew the answer himself. As they walked, he noticed a few people turning, whispering. Some recognized him, some recognized Daniel from the building he worked in as night janitor. The contrast between them was glaring, obvious, cruel. Two lives that never should have intersected. Two men who loved the same woman, one by blood, one by choice. By the time they reached the pond, Luna had released Richard's sleeve and run ahead to chase ducks. He and Daniel stood a short distance away, watching her. "She looks like her mother," Richard murmured. Daniel nodded. "And she laughs like her too." Richard's chest tightened. "I've missed so many years." Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The weight of what Richard had lost and what Daniel had carried alone hung in the air. After a long moment, Daniel spoke quietly. "I want to trust you. I do. But I need to know something." Richard braced himself. "Ask." Daniel turned to him fully. His expression wasn't hostile. It was honest, vulnerable, tired. "What do you want from her? From us?" Richard stared at the ground for a moment, then lifted his eyes, his voice steadier than he felt. "I want to know my granddaughter. I want to be a part of her life, not to replace you, not to take her, but to give her things I failed to give her mother." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Money?" "No," Richard said sharply. "A family." Daniel looked taken aback. Richard continued, voice cracking slightly. "Isabel died thinking I didn't want her to live her own life. That's what eats me alive, every day. I can't fix what I did to her, but I can try to love the little piece of her that's still here." Daniel's voice went quiet. "Luna doesn't know how to live in fancy places. She doesn't know your world." "I don't want her in my world," Richard said. "I want to be part of hers." Daniel blinked at that. His entire body seemed to soften by a fraction. Before either could say more, a loud splash erupted. Luna had leaned too far toward the pond and slipped. "Daddy!" Daniel bolted, Richard right behind him. The water wasn't deep, but the shock had frightened her. She thrashed, crying, cold and scared. Daniel pulled her out immediately, wrapping her in his coat, kissing her wet forehead over and over again. "It's okay. You're okay," he whispered. Richard hovered beside them, helpless and terrified. Luna sobbed, clinging to her father, her only parent, the man who had been everything for her since her first breath. And Richard understood something brutal then. He wasn't the only one grieving Isabel. Luna was too. In a way a child shouldn't have to. Daniel soothed her until the cries softened. Richard reached out slowly. "Luna," he said gently, "are you hurt?" She sniffled, wiping her nose on Daniel's coat sleeve, then looked at Richard. "My shoe is wet." Richard let out a shaky breath, a small inconvenience, not a tragedy, and nodded. "We'll get you new ones," he said softly. At that, Daniel lifted his eyes, wary. "She doesn't need fancy shoes, she just needs dry ones." Richard nodded. "Then that's exactly what she'll get."
Back at Daniel's apartment, a small two-bedroom in a quiet, aging building in Queens, Luna changed into dry clothes and crawled into bed for a nap, exhausted from crying and excitement. Richard stood near the doorway of her room, quiet, humbled. The room was tiny, but warm, filled with drawings taped along the walls and toys donated from neighbors. Daniel stood beside him, arms crossed. "You can come in," he said after a moment. Richard stepped in. There was a framed picture on Luna's nightstand. Isabel, smiling wide, holding a 1-year-old Luna in her lap. Her hair was longer, her eyes softer. A version of her that he had never seen. "Daniel," Richard whispered, voice trembling. "She was happy." Daniel nodded. "She was. Even without me?" "I think she missed you," Daniel admitted softly. "But she didn't want to live under your expectations. She wanted freedom. She wanted love on her own terms." Richard closed his eyes. He had spent 10 years drowning in guilt and grief, believing Isabel had been unhappy, lost, drifting. But she had built a life, a family, a love, and he hadn't known any of it. The realization split something open inside him, a wound that had festered for a decade, finally bleeding. When Luna woke later, groggy and warm, she reached for Daniel first, but then she noticed Richard standing nearby. "Are you still here?" she asked. Richard swallowed. "If you want me to be." Luna thought for a moment, then nodded. "You're not scary. You're sad, but nice." Daniel chuckled a little under his breath. "She's very honest." Richard kneeled beside her bed. "I want to get to know you, but only if you want that too." Luna studied him with that startling instinct children had, a purity adults forgot how to use. Finally, she poked his cheek. "I want you to come back." Daniel watched, eyes shining, and something monumental shifted between the two men. A pact not spoken, but understood. They were no longer rivals bound by tragedy. They were two parts of the same story. But every story with joy has a shadow. The unraveling began 3 days later. It started with a reporter. A girl with a microphone and too much hunger in her eyes. She cornered Daniel outside his building. "Is it true?" she asked breathlessly. "Is it true that Richard Whitmore has a secret granddaughter?" Daniel froze. Before he could answer, another reporter ran up, then another, and another. By nightfall, Richard Whitmore's hidden family scandal was trending nationwide. A billionaire with a secret child, a janitor raising his heiress daughter, a 10-year-old tragedy resurfacing into the light. The city devoured the story, and the headlines multiplied like wildfire. Inside his penthouse office, Richard stared at the screen, heart pounding, as the world ripped open a part of his life he had only just begun to heal. He had wanted to be in Luna's life, quietly, gently. But now everything, his shame, his past failures, his daughter's memory, was being weaponized by the world he had built his empire in. And the worst part? He didn't know who had leaked it. But he was going to find out who, and someone was going to regret it.
The news spread faster than common sense. Within 24 hours, the Whitmore secret granddaughter scandal had swallowed every headline, every gossip site, every financial column desperate to speculate what this meant for the billionaire's empire. But none of them understood the truth. They weren't reporting on a scandal. They were reporting on a heart trying to heal. Richard Whitmore had survived financial crises, hostile takeovers, political storms, and public smear campaigns. But this, a little girl's existence, was something fragile, precious, and private. And now it had been dragged into the light by vultures who didn't care who bled, as long as eyes stayed glued to their screens. At 7:12 a.m., Richard's penthouse elevator opened to chaos. His board members, PR team, attorneys, and assistants crowded his private conference room. Screens flashed headlines, voices tangled over one another. His name was everywhere. Whitmore family secret revealed, billionaire's hidden granddaughter, Janitor raised his only heir. A photo taken outside Daniel's apartment, Luna holding Daniel's hand while a reporter snapped a picture, was plastered across every screen. Richard clenched his jaw. That image wasn't a headline. It was a violation. "Sit," he ordered. The room fell silent instantly. His PR director, a sharp woman named Caroline, pushed her glasses up her nose. "Richard, the media is escalating. Investors are panicking. Rumors are spreading that you are diverting assets to—" "I don't care about rumors," he said flatly. A lawyer cleared his throat. "There's a potential legal, that is, if Daniel attempts to seek child support retroactively, or—" "Daniel hasn't asked for a dime," Richard snapped. "He didn't even ask to meet me." His CFO spoke next. "Sir, the timing is terrible. We have the acquisition vote next week. If the media paints this as you hiding and illegitimate, watch your next word." He swallowed. Richard's voice dropped to ice. "Luna is my daughter's child. She is not a scandal. She is not an inconvenience. She is family." The room fell silent again. But the damage had already been done. Someone in this very room had leaked the story. Someone who saw Luna not as a blessing, but as a threat, politically, financially, or personally. Richard scanned every face, every twitch, every nervous swallow. Then he said quietly, "Which one of you is going to tell me who leaked it?" No one spoke. Of course they didn't. Cowards rarely did. His assistant, Mallory, stepped closer. "Sir, maybe we should hold a press statement?" "No," he said. "I'm going to Daniel." The room erupted. "You can't be seen with him. Reporters are everywhere. The board needs you. You'll make it worse." Richard slammed his fist onto the table so hard, pens jumped, papers scattered, and several people flinched. "This isn't about my company," he growled. "This is about my family." And before anyone could argue, he walked out. Daniel's apartment building was already under siege by reporters, cameras, and drones hovering illegally near the windows. Richard pushed through them like a storm with a pulse. "Mr. Whitmore, is it true you hid your granddaughter for 10 years? Are you paying off the child's father? Did your daughter die estranged because of you? Is the janitor blackmailing you for custody? Is the child's mother really your daughter, or is this a cover-up?" Those last words almost made him turn around, but he kept walking. Daniel met him at the door, exhausted, angry, and protective, an expression Richard recognized well. A man defending his child. Daniel moved so that his body shielded the doorway. "This is getting out of control." "I know." "You brought reporters to my home." "I didn't," Richard said firmly. "But someone did. Someone who wanted to use Luna for leverage." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I don't care about your company's problems. I care about my daughter not being chased by strangers with cameras. I want to protect her, and you." Daniel scoffed. "Protect us? By putting us on newspapers?" Richard took a breath, steadying himself. "Let me inside, please." Daniel hesitated, then stepped back. Inside, Luna sat on the couch, hugging a stuffed rabbit, eyes red from crying. She looked up. "Grandpa, are the people outside mad at me?" Richard's heart cracked cleanly down the center. "No, sweetheart," he said gently, kneeling in front of her. "They're just confused. They heard a big story and they want to know more. But I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't," he whispered. "You didn't do anything at all." Daniel watched the scene quietly, arms folded. Luna scooted closer and touched Richard's cheek. "Are you mad too?" He shook his head. "Never." A moment later, Daniel cleared his throat. "We need to talk." He stepped into the kitchen, leaving Luna in the living room with cartoons playing softly. Daniel didn't waste time. "I want to know what your plan is." Richard's jaw tightened. "My plan was to ease into your lives, give you support quietly, build trust. But now someone has forced this into the public eye." Daniel looked him dead in the eye. "So now what?" He exhaled. "Now I protect her, with everything I have." Daniel shook his head. "I don't want your money." "This isn't about money." "Isn't it?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Your people think I'm after a payout. They're already digging into my job, my past, every hospital bill from Isabel's birth." Richard stiffened. "They're doing what?" Daniel grabbed a small stack of papers off the counter. Printouts, screenshots, leaked emails. "They're investigating us like we're criminals." Richard read them and felt his blood go cold. Requests for background checks, financial history, employment verification, even a request to locate Luna's birth certificate through a private investigator. All from someone inside his own empire. Someone trying to discredit Daniel. Someone trying to paint Luna as illegitimate. Someone trying to cut Isabel out of her own daughter's story. And Richard felt something ancient awaken inside him. A protective rage he had never used, not when raising Isabel, not when fighting board members, not when building skyscrapers. This wasn't business anymore. This was blood. He lowered the papers slowly. "I will find who did this." Daniel didn't soften. "And when you do, they won't work another day in this city." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good." He wasn't agreeing for Richard's sake. He was agreeing for Luna. Before they could speak again, Luna appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy? Can we leave? The noises outside are scary." Daniel knelt beside her. "We can't go out right now, baby." She looked at Richard with trembling lips. "Can you make the scary people go away?" And Richard Whitmore, the man who could buy anything, command anyone, bend cities to his will, felt utterly powerless. "I'll do my best," he said softly. "No," Daniel corrected. "You'll do more than that, because you owe her." He wasn't wrong. Richard straightened, voice firm. "Pack whatever you need. You're coming with me." Daniel's brows shot up. "What?" "My penthouse, tight security, private elevator, no press, no cameras, no leaks." Daniel hesitated. "I'm not leaving my home." "You're not. You're taking a temporary refuge so your daughter can sleep without fear." Luna tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Daddy, I don't like the scary people." And that was all it took. Daniel exhaled shakily. "Fine." Richard nodded once, decisive. "Let's go." As Daniel packed a small bag for Luna, clothes, a toothbrush, a few toys, and the worn stuffed revet she refused to sleep without, Richard stood by the window, watching reporters like wolves circling prey on the street below. When Daniel returned with the bag, Richard met his eyes. "This ends," he said. "Tonight." Daniel didn't ask how. He didn't need to. Because the man standing before him wasn't a billionaire protecting an empire. He was a grandfather protecting a child. And whoever had leaked the story had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed.
Richard stood in the center of the living room like a man surrounded by invisible fire. The room that had always represented power, polished marble floors, framed awards, priceless art, now felt like a cage he had built with his own hands, a cage lined with secrets he never knew existed. Ethan sat on the couch with Mia asleep across his lap, her tiny hand curled loosely around his thumb, as if she were clinging to the only steady thing she had left. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes rimmed red from crying, but he held himself with a kind of exhausted dignity. Richard couldn't sit, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every time he looked at Mia, his chest twisted painfully. His granddaughter, his blood, Isabel's child, the child he could have known, the child he could have protected, the child he could have loved. Instead, she had grown up in the shadows, while he drowned himself in work and grief. He finally managed to speak, though the words scraped out as a whisper. Why didn't she tell me? Ethan's fingers tightened around Mia's small hand. She tried, he said softly. She really did. Those two words sliced through Richard like blades. Tried. He sank onto the opposite chair, elbows on knees, his voice low and cracking. Explain. Ethan swallowed hard. You remember the months before she died, when she moved out of your penthouse? Richard flinched as if struck. I told her she needed to grow up, that she was throwing away her future. That night, he murmured, she showed up at my apartment shaking. She said you had called her irresponsible, said she wasn't ready to be a mother, said you threatened to cut her off if she didn't come home and follow your plans. Richard's stomach nodded. That's not what I meant, he said, voice trembling. I was trying to keep her safe. She was too young, too trusting. I was terrified some man would take advantage of her. Ethan's eyes lifted, tired but unflinching. I wasn't trying to take advantage of her. I loved her. I still do. Silence fell. Heavy, dense, unavoidable. Isabel didn't move out because of you. She moved out because she knew she had to choose between living her life and living the one you designed for her. Richard looked down at the floor, every breath feeling like sand in his lungs. Why didn't she just tell me she was pregnant? He whispered. She planned to. Ethan shifted, brushing Mia's hair back gently. The night before she died, she told me she wanted to call you. She wanted you to know about the baby. She didn't want to shut you out forever. She wanted you to have a chance to be part of our lives. She needed time. Richard closed his eyes. His throat shook. His voice broke. She never called. She tried. He hesitated. But you were on that trip to Tokyo. She left a voicemail. You never heard it? Richard froze. A voicemail? His eyes flew open. He remembered the night the call came from the hospital. He remembered the chaos, the frantic flight, the crushing grief, and he remembered something else too. Deleting all messages from that week because he couldn't bear hearing people's condolences. Oh God. His heart slammed into his ribs. I might have erased it, he whispered, horrified. I didn't know. Ethan bowed his head. She died thinking you didn't want her, thinking she had to protect our baby from your world. Richard's breath hitched. My world? Ethan looked up again, and this time, for the first time, Richard saw something in his eyes that wasn't fear or grief. It was anger, deep, quiet, and old. Mr. Whitmore, your world crushed her. The pressure, the expectations, the headlines, the constant surveillance. She told me she used to wake up afraid she'd disappoint you just by breathing wrong. Richard's hands shook uncontrollably, because the worst part wasn't Ethan's words,
It was that they were true. Isabel had always been gentle, soft-spoken, creative. She loved photography, animals, rainstorms, barefoot mornings in the backyard. She didn't fit into boardrooms. She didn't want to be the perfect society daughter. But he pushed anyway, pushed hard. Trying to protect her, he had smothered her instead. His voice cracked. If I had known about the baby. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't lash out. He simply said, "Would it have changed anything? Or would she just have become another project for you to manage?" Richard flinched as if the question were physical pain. "I loved her," he whispered fiercely. "All I ever wanted was for her to be safe." But she wasn't safe. Not from the storm around her, not from the pressure, not from trying to be perfect for you. Suddenly, Mia stirred, a soft whimper. She shifted in her sleep until her head rested fully on Ethan's chest. Richard's heart cracked open at the sight. Isabel's chin, Isabel's hair, Isabel's tiny dimple on her left cheek. All these years he had mourned what he thought he lost, but what he truly lost was time. 10 years of a life that could have been filled with laughter, birthdays, bedtime stories. Sometimes grief feels like drowning, but this felt like being buried alive. Richard leaned back, his voice low and devastated. "I missed everything. Her childhood, her first words, her first steps, her smile." Ethan nodded gently toward Mia. "She smiles like Izzy. Same crooked grin when she's hiding candy under her pillow." A tear slid down Richard's cheek before he could stop it. He wiped it away angrily, ashamed of how broken he felt. "Why didn't you come to me?" he finally asked, his voice cracking. "Because I was scared," Ethan said honestly. "You're a billionaire. I'm a janitor. I thought you'd take her away. I thought you'd destroy me in court. And I was right. If I had come to you 5 years ago, you would have." Richard wanted to deny it. He wanted to claim he was better than that. But he wasn't. 5 years ago, he was iron, unbending, cold, ruthless. The board didn't call him the Granite King for nothing. He would have taken Mia. Not out of love, but out of control. And that realization, that ugly, shameful truth, crushed him. Ethan looked down at Mia, brushing her cheek with the back of his...
"She's all I have," he whispered. "Izzy was the love of my life. In Mia, she's the last piece of her I have left. I would give up everything before I let anyone hurt her." Richard stared at the child, his heart twisting. "Have I hurt her?" he asked quietly, terrified of the answer. "Not yet," Ethan said, "but the world you live in, the headlines, the pressure, the lawyers, the greedy relatives, that world will." Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then help me protect her." Ethan's head jerked up, startled. Richard's voice trembled, raw and unfiltered. "Please, I can't lose another piece of my daughter. I'm begging you, teach me how to do this right." Ethan stared at him, really stared. For the first time, he saw a man who wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a tycoon, wasn't the stone-faced figure from business magazines. He saw a father, broken, desperate, human. But he also saw someone who had the power to ruin everything without meaning to. "Mr. Whitmore," Ethan whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you."
Richard nodded. I know. A long silence settled between them. Mia breathed softly. The city hummed distantly outside. Two men sat in the ruins of a decade of secrets. Finally, Ethan asked the question that would determine everything. What exactly do you want from us? Richard inhaled shakily. And the answer, the one he had been terrified of, ashamed of, yet aching to say, finally left his lips. I want a chance to be in her life, a chance to make up for what I failed to do for my daughter, a chance to be her grandfather. Ethan didn't speak. He simply looked down at Mia, sleeping peacefully across his arms. The child whose life could change forever with one single yes, or be upended entirely with one wrong move. The moment stretched, fragile, waiting to break. And that is where everything, trust, fear, love, grief, collided. Because the next words spoken in that room would determine the future of all three of them.
Ethan didn't answer right away. He sat frozen, one hand resting protectively on Mia's small back, his entire body curled instinctively toward her, shielding her from the world, from the pain, from the man sitting just a few feet away. Richard waited. He didn't move, didn't speak, barely breathed. For a man used to commanding boardrooms, governments, and entire industries, waiting for one young father's decision felt like the most agonizing silence of his life. Finally, Ethan lifted his gaze, and in his eyes Richard saw not defiance, not anger, not fear, but sorrow. Mr. Whitmore, Ethan began quietly, you have every resource in the world, every connection, every lawyer, every advantage. I'm just a janitor. I live paycheck to paycheck. I fix broken lights and clean school hallways, but I will fight for her. I will fight with everything in me. Richard swallowed. I'm not trying to take her. Even if you're not, Ethan cut in gently. Your world will. Your lawyers, your advisors, your shareholders, your reputation, your family. Someone will whisper in your ear that a child belongs with her blood. Someone will tell you I'm unfit because I'm poor. Someone will show you a legal loophole that lets you win. He shook his head slowly. And even if you don't act on it, even your presence could tear her life apart. Richard felt the truth of it like a punch. The media, the paparazzi, the gossip columns, the vultures circling every billionaire story. If the world learned that the Whitmore empire had a secret heir, there would be chaos. Please, Richard whispered, don't shut me out before I've even begun. Ethan looked away, not out of disrespect, but because the decision was tearing him apart. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice almost breaking. Do you know what Isabel made me promise the night Mia was born? Richard shook his head. Ethan's throat tightened. She made me promise that Mia would grow up happy. Not perfect, not rich, just happy. He looked down at the little girl, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. Isabel wanted her to climb trees, scrape her knees, eat ice cream until her tongue turned blue. She wanted her to be safe from the world that watched every move she made. A tear slipped down Richard's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. Because he finally understood what that promise cost and what it meant. He had spent years believing he failed as a father. Now he realized he had failed at something deeper. He had failed to make space for Isabel to live, and now the consequences sat sleeping on his couch, tiny and fragile and impossibly precious. Ethan continued softly. If I let you into her life, everything changes. Reporters, headlines, photographers waiting outside her school, people digging through our trash, our finances, our past. She'll lose the anonymity Isabel fought to give her. Richard leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees,
voice low and desperate. "I can protect her." Ethan stared at him for a long moment before answering. "No, Mr. Widmore. You can't." The words hit harder than any boardroom defeat, harder than market crashes, harder than the night he lost Isabel, because they were true. Money could buy privacy, but it also bought attention, and attention was poison. Richard exhaled shakily. "Then what do I do?" Ethan hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, he gently shifted Mia, supporting her head so she wouldn't wake, and stood up. He stepped closer to Richard, close enough that the billionaire could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the sleepless nights, the fear, the fierce love. "Here's the truth," Ethan said softly. "I'm terrified of you. I'm terrified of what your power could do to her life. I'm terrified that one wrong move from you could destroy the little world I built to keep her safe." Then he took a breath. "But I also know Isabel wouldn't want you cut out. She loved you. She hated disappointing you, and she would have wanted her daughter to know her grandfather." Richard's eyes stung sharply. He nodded slowly, voice cracking. "I would give anything for that chance." "I know," Ethan whispered. Then, carefully, reluctantly, he extended a compromise. "I'll let you in, but on conditions." "Anything," Richard said immediately. Ethan took a steadying breath. "First, no lawyers, no custody talks, no paperwork, nothing that turns Mia into a legal battle." Richard nodded. "Second, no public announcements, no press releases, no leaks. Nobody beyond this room needs to know you're her grandfather, not until she's old enough to understand what that means." Richard's throat tightened. "Agreed." "Third, you come into her life slowly, gently, as a friend, not as a billionaire swooping in with gifts and promises. She doesn't need a savior. She needs stability." "I can do that." "Fourth, you never use your money to pressure me. Ever. Not for decisions, not for parenting choices, not for anything. I swear it." Ethan hesitated at the last one. The hardest one. "Fifth," he said quietly, "you earn her trust before you earn mine." Richard felt something inside him crack open, not painfully, but like an old wound that had been waiting to heal. He nodded, not with pride, not with power, not with authority, but with humility. "Yes," he whispered. "I will." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then finally extended his hand. It was not a handshake between equals. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Richard reached out with trembling fingers and took his hand. Their grip was firm, uncertain, but real. In that moment, with a sleeping child between them, the walls that wealth and grief had built began to crumble. Just then, Mia stirred awake. Her little eyes blinked sleepily. She looked around the unfamiliar room, confused for a moment, before turning toward Ethan. "Daddy?" she mumbled. Richard's heart nearly stopped. Her voice. Her tiny voice. Ethan crouched beside her. "I'm here, sweetheart." She rubbed her eyes, then noticed Richard watching her from across the room. The billionaire froze, unsure of what expression to wear, unsure how to smile without frightening her. Mia stared at him for a long second. Then she whispered, "Hi." Just one syllable. Small, soft, innocent. But for Richard, it felt like sunlight cracking through a decade of darkness. He swallowed and whispered back,
Hi. Mia glanced at her father. Who's he? Ethan and Richard exchanged a look filled with grief, hope, and the weight of what was still unsaid. Ethan smoothed Mia's hair, his voice gentle. He's someone who cared a lot about Mommy. Mia blinked. You knew Mommy? Richard's breath caught. He nodded slowly. Yes, very much. Mia studied him with an intensity that seemed far older than her years. Then, without warning, she smiled. A crooked, tiny grin identical to Isabel's. Richard felt his soul shatter and rebuild all at once. He didn't reach for her. He didn't overwhelm her. He didn't claim anything. He just smiled back, tears blurring his vision. Because for the first time in a decade, there was something to hope for, something to protect, something to love, something to live for. And as the afternoon light drifted through the windows, soft and golden, Richard Whitmore, billionaire, tycoon, once a man carved from stone, quietly whispered the truth he finally understood. I won't fail you. Not again. The reckoning had come, but so had the beginning. A fragile, imperfect, precious beginning, built not on wealth, not on power, but on love. And this time he wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He wouldn't drown himself in business and regret. He would stay. For her. For the little girl who carried Isabel's smile. For the second chance he never believed he would get. For the family he had lost, and the one he was finally brave enough to fight for.